Gang, in 2020, a chilling documentary called The Social Dilemma hit Netflix and sent the world abuzz. Some called it groundbreaking, but the ground had actually already been broken by our guest. Call him Nostradamus if you'd like, but our guest had been talking for years about the dangers of digital distraction in his first book, Disconnected. We should have listened to him then, but he's given us another chance now with his new book, Raising Healthy Teenagers. I'm the dad of a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, so you're now invited to listen in on basically a therapy session from our guest, Tom Kersting. Tom, welcome to the Goaro podcast, my friend.
All right, Joey, good to be here, buddy.
Man, it's good to talk to you. Really excited to have you here. I have been. I mean, when I just even seeing the title of your book enough, I had to have it and then had to talk to you. It's full of such great insight. And I want to dive in and hopefully this is a conversation that's very, very tactical for people out there on, hey, I want to understand what's going on, but then what do I do about it? So you were a counselor for 25 years, right?
In a public high school, yeah.
Public high school, 25 years. So you started when? Was that 95? Is that right?
Yeah, 95. And then, I got licensed as a private practice therapist in like 2001. I've been doing that for 22 years now. So now I retired from the high school. I'm doing just that and lecturing and everything else. So.
Amazing. So in that time, so 1995 to 2020, what would you say in terms of just behavior, not necessarily like external changes, but in the behavior you saw from kids? What were the biggest shifts you saw in behavior in that 25 years?
Well, it's interesting. I actually talk about that in the book when people say, hey, what was it like, being a school counselor back in the mid 90s, early 2000s, right, compared to like 3 years ago when I retired? I'm like, well, it went from our high school being a place of educating students to being a place where it's now half educational and half mental health. And that really began, this mental health stuff really started primarily right after 2012.
Gosh, so and we'll get to why. I think we all know why. I'm curious if you were to have written a book entitled Raising Healthy Teenagers, if you would have written that in 1995, what are maybe the top three things you would have written about at that time? And raising healthy teenagers, it's still hard, no matter when the year is. It's very complicated now, but 1995, what would you have written about? What would have been the keys to raising healthy teenagers then?
I'm not sure I could have filled a book back then, but what was going on then? All right, stay away from marijuana, all right, which is now out of control.
Right.
Do your homework, listen to your parents, and go to church.
Gosh, and that's it, and you'd be just fine. And it really is pretty true. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1999, and so it's not far from the truth. It was relatively easy compared to now, but even then, I mean, it seemed very difficult. So you've seen a bunch change since then. We were talking right before here. So your first book was called Disconnected, and that was in 2016, and this was all about digital dependency and all of that. So I'm interested in that. You told me something that blew my mind, is that you had been talking about that issue since 2009. You gave your first lecture. So what did you see early on that sparked something that said, oh boy, this is trouble?
Well, that is how this book Disconnected starts. Right. Yeah. So when I was working at the public high school, then I ran a committee called the 504 committee. So we used to handle something called 504 accommodations, which is for regular education students that have some kind of an impairment. Then we give them accommodations, right? So sitting in a meeting, September 2008, and it's first week of September, and the protocol is the parents have to meet with the committee, and then we determine if the child is eligible for accommodations. Parents come in, and they go on to explain that their 14-year-old son had been recently diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, okay? Now, hear me out on this one, people listening. All right, this is interesting stuff. So I remember sitting in a meeting saying, really, wow, 14 years old being diagnosed with ADHD, and it's really good. How did this kid fall through the cracks, right? Because the average age of diagnosis for attention deficit disorder is 8 years old. And if you have a child with ADHD, you can't not notice the symptoms by the time they're 5. And it's a neurological condition that you are born with. You don't just all of a sudden get it when you're 14.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what I highlighted, long story short, from that point on for the remainder of the school year, like 90% of the referrals that were coming into our committee were for students that had recently been diagnosed with ADHD. And I hadn't seen one of those in the previous 10 years. So that's what led me to start researching. Everything pointed. I came across some research by Gary Small, who's a renowned professor out of UCLA. And in that research, one of the guys on his team coined a term that he referred to as acquired attention deficit disorder. Not
Wow.
an official term. So essentially what was happening is even back then, from kids being on the internet and stuff like that,
Hmm.
it causes something known as brain neuroplasticity. The brain actually rewires itself, grows new neural pathways, prunes those away that aren't being used. And what was happening is that they, in that research, they believe that about 70% of kids that are older didn't actually have ADHD. They just had the symptoms of it because their brain had gotten confused, and now, it was incapable of using its executive functions properly
Hmm.
because of constantly being distracted. So that's what prompted me to start getting out ahead of this.
I'm curious on that. I actually didn't know that it was something you were born with, and there you show the symptoms. So the symptoms are what is diagnosed as the acquired ADD, right? So that when you start seeing the symptoms, but you weren't necessarily born with it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so like all of a sudden your child is inattentive, lack of focus, disorganized, right? Maybe even a little rambunctious and so forth. Go to the pediatrician. It's not that hard to diagnose it. You just meet 6 of the 10 criteria. You have ADHD, right?
Mm.
But there's countless people out there kids being diagnosed with ADHD because they have the symptoms, but they actually don't have ADHD.
So how does medication factor? I don't want to go to be too tangential. It's just interesting to me. So how does medication factor into that then with somebody who isn't actually born with ADHD but is exhibiting the symptoms of it? Is that still effective for the symptomatic without the actual true diagnosis?
Yeah, well, it's something like, Adderall is probably one of the biggest prescribed drugs,
Hmm.
and Adderall, even if you and I went and took that, we'd become laser focused, right?
Okay,
Um,
got it.
but Ritalin, which was like, the premier one for
Yeah.
many years, I remember reading once that like basically Ritalin it's a stimulant, but if somebody actually has ADHD, it has the opposite effect and allows you to, to be calm and focused and so forth.
Right.
That's the big question because there really are probably thousands and thousands of kids that are on ADHD medication that actually don't have ADHD. And the only way you can know that when parents come into to my office, they
Hmm.
have a 14 or 15-year-old and they say, oh yeah, he's all of a sudden was diagnosed with ADHD from the pediatrician or whatever. I'll tell them before you go try any medication, unplug your kid for about a month as best you can.
Wow.
And I'll guarantee that all of a sudden the executive functions start to come back and kicking back into gear, and that your kid, and if it doesn't, then maybe the kid does have ADHD.
Right. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So 2016 Disconnected came out, and here we are 2023. It seems like things have changed just a tad since then. And it was, I mean, I mentioned the social dilemma in the intro. People really became aware of it. And we talk about if we would have started RO 5 years ago, we would have had to convince people of a lot of things. And now everybody just understands it. But what are some things since then, since 2016 to now, since you wrote Disconnected, that you've learned the way things have evolved, and in what direction are things moving since then?
Well, interestingly, I'll actually go back to a little bit earlier than that, 2012, right? So I mentioned
Hmm.
that 504 committee that I used
Yeah.
to run at the high school. So all these kids, being diagnosed with ADHD were coming in. Right after 2012, that changed. And the
Mm.
predominant impairment that was coming into our committee was anxiety disorders, major anxiety.
Wow.
So bad, in fact, right, starting in 2012, that I would get more phone calls from the nurse's office per week for a kid that's having an emotional meltdown or panic attack or something. Starting in 2012, I would get more of those calls from the nurse's office per week than I used to get per school year. And
Wow.
at my
Mm.
private practice, starting in 2012, I started getting more referrals from middle school age kids with major anxiety issues
Wow.
weekly than I used to get per year.
Mm.
And I highlight that in the previous book,
Yeah.
Disconnected. I call it acquired anxiety disorder.
Mm.
Yeah, and essentially, what happens is once these kids get their first phones, they're 10, 11 years old. Everything was fine before that. Then
Yeah.
things start to kind of unravel. They start to fall behind in school. And it starts to lead to a very hostile home environment, which is just tension, 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 which is contagious. Kid falls behind in school. Then they get caught up with comparison culture.
Mm.
Trying to be noticed, get likes, followers. And this is during a very difficult stage of development called pre-adolescence or adolescence.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is anxiety provoking. Now you throw in
Yes.
all this other content, this comparing oneself to other, the lack of sleep that kids are getting, teenagers, and so forth. And it's like the perfect storm to have to develop major anxiety, plus all of the nonsense that's just being funneled over and over
Mm.
again through social media because everything is caught on camera nowadays and everybody's
Yeah.
walking on eggshells as a result.
That anxiety, that's You hit on it there, and I don't know that we're people talk about it a lot. I don't know that we're focusing enough on sleep, bro. If I get a bad night of sleep, I'm done. I'm toast. I can't imagine what it's like for a child to be sleep deprived. And I say this all the time. If I would have had the internet as a 14-year-old boy, I would have never slept. There's nothing I wouldn't, nefarious or not, I would have never slept because it's super interesting and you can go down a wormhole and it never ends. So it's just the sleep deprivation alone could cause some major trauma for people.
So I'll give you a good little stat. All right.
Yeah.
So my last year at the high school, so what was that, 2020? Yeah, we're in 2023, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I collected my own data. All right. So we had 1,000 kids in the high school, and kids would come down to my office all the time, just sometimes just to hang out. They like to come to lunch and chat. I'm a likable guy. And I asked them, so I did over the course of the whole school year, I asked around 100 kids. I said, listen, they're in my office. I got a question for you. I'm collecting data. I'm not going to use your name. I'm not going to call your parents. Just answer this question for me. And they said, sure, Mr. K. They would call me. I'm like, all right, what time do you go to sleep on weeknights? All right. And I'm not kidding, Joey. 90 something out of those 100 kids told me that they went to sleep between 1 and 4 a.m. every night of the school week, and their parents had no idea. So I'm going to ask you a question. So what's my first tip to parents that are listening right now?
Yeah, devices out of the room, right?
Get the darn devices out of those bedrooms, particularly at night. They should not be in there. Kids say I need it as an alarm clock. They're sneaking on them. They're looking at them. And, you're talking about a kid. They don't know they don't think yet. They're impulsive. Right. You know what I mean? And, and they're going to sneak on that phone when mom and dad are asleep and try to hide it and so forth. So that's the rules I always had in my own house. My youngest is 16, my daughter. That phone comes down here at 9:30, 10 o'clock every night. No questions asked.
Just that alone. I mean, think of the shift in that. What if we all just adopt? There's a bunch of other stuff we should look at, but what if we just did that and just focused on the sleep side of things? That would be transformational.
Just that.
So that led you to 2012. So that led you to writing the book Disconnected. What was the reception? I'm curious at that time from people. Was it this guy's crazy? This guy, hey, I think you're onto something. How did people receive that at that time? Now everybody would agree with everything in it, but what was the reception at that time?
So it was a mixed bag, because a lot of time, I was still continue to lecture. So a lot of the feedback I get is during lectures. People ask questions and answers. Most people walk out of there like with their jaws dropping. But they also feel empowered because they know what to do. But then you get some parents that try to challenge you a little bit, and that's because they're defensive.
Right.
Because everything I just told them, they're living, and it's very hard for us to hear a reality without trying to deflect it, right? Because you feel like you're a bad parent. You're not a bad parent. You're just an uninformed parent. So a lot of the stuff I talked about in the first edition of Disconnected, there wasn't even any research done. Like when I was talking about anxiety being caused by the devices and so forth, there was no research to substantiate that. The mental health epidemic, there was no research. I knew this anecdotally because I was looking at it. And like you said, now everything is real. Everything I've written about in that first edition is is just, there's no debating any of it.
So you've since then, so you updated, so 2016 you wrote it, you've updated it since. So now you've come out with Raising Healthy Teenagers. And again, I've been so excited for this because I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, and even as intentional parents, and we've done an okay job, I think, but there are things, and I think the main thing that comes up to me, Tom, is where I think, okay, my son's 15. Have I done everything? What can I do now? Is it too late for me to implement new things that I need to? And the book's all about equipping your child. The subtitle is equipping your child to navigate the pitfalls and dangers of teen lives. And you have a line in the intro. Your goal of the book, you said, is to inform, not scare you of what's going on in our children's minds and lives and why. So as a dad who doesn't know what's going on in my kids' minds most of the time, what is going on in our children's minds and lives, and why is it going on?
So, I love that question, right? So, and I also love a quote by a famous German philosopher, Nietzsche, all right? Mm-hmm. And he had a quote. He said, "We're under the presumption that we're thinking, but in reality, we are being thought." So it's sort of a play on words. So what does that mean? Being thought. What he means by that is we're being controlled by our thought rather than being in control of our thought.
Yep.
So you take a kid who spends on average 9 to 10 hours a day, right, being bombarded with content, right, information, a lot of which is not healthy content, being bombarded with that. that now makes its way into their subconscious mind and becomes their reality. So they're now controlled by their thinking rather than being in control of their thinking.
Hmm.
So when I'm speaking to kids, what I always tell them, I implore them, I say, this is what I want you to do. And if you can't do this, then you're a full-blown addict. And what I implore them to do is to sit every day for 15 minutes in total silence without a single distraction, right? And go deep within oneself. That's the rest of the iceberg. That's the depth of us. That's where all of our confidence, our joy and happiness is. And use your thinking instead of being used by it. Visualize, think about what you're grateful for. And and it's a way of really just turning this around, because
Newport wrote Digital Minimalism.
yeah, I think I've seen that before. Yeah.
He talks about, and I love the concept you just mentioned, which was that 15 minutes, which by the way seems basic, but go ahead and try it. Anybody listening, try to have any amount of time without any inputs. I a couple of years ago, I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go on a walk with no inputs. I was like, oh, you know what I should do? I should listen to a podcast. Wait. No, that's an input. I can't do that. Oh, I'm going to listen to some music. Hold on. Even that's an input. That's something coming in to my mind instead of just having a blank canvas. Even, oh, I'm going to go read it. I'm going to go read. I'm going to do a devotional. Even that is an input. So it's a really challenging thing to do. So when kids start to do that, what happens? By the way, I found it was extraordinarily uncomfortable at first. And then it became very comfortable and wonderful after that. And then I had creative thoughts sparking all over the place. So what's that experience for kids when they begin to just have that 15 minutes?
So what's interesting is what you just mentioned is we have become so accustomed to distracting ourselves.
Yeah.
And what we're ultimately distracting ourselves from is self, right? So what is self-esteem, right? I talk about that in my lecture. Self-esteem is me. It's how I feel. It's not what other people think about me, right? But how do we even know what self is? And I'll ask kids at lectures, I'll say the following, Joey, when I get to this point of my lectures about self-esteem and so forth, what I call cyber self-esteem, I'll ask the kids in the front, I'll say, all right, who are you? And I know what the answer is going to be. It's predictable every time. The kid says, oh, hi, I'm John Smith. Hey, John. And then I ask the next kid, who are you? And they tell me their name, and I'll ask another kid, right? And then I'll ask one of those kids, I'll say, ask me who I am. And I'll say, who are you? And my response is, I'm not Tom Kersting. That's just the name my parents gave me. Here's who I am. I am a caring, loving, motivated, determined, empathetic, powerful, spiritual being.
Wow.
And then I go on to say to the kids, I'm not saying that because I'm trying to boast. I'm saying that because every one of you in this room is also that, but you'll never know that if you never delve within yourself. And the only way to do that is in the silence. And if you never go into the silence, life is just a distraction and you're just controlled instead of being in control.
I think whenever you have that strong sense of identity, that strong sense of self, then you start to act, because you just said about yourself, you identify yourself as empathetic. I bet that makes you more empathetic just because you've identified yourself as being empathetic. And you say, I'm caring, when you think, well, wait, I'm caring, so I need to do the things that a caring person does. So it's almost like you become more like the person you say you are, right?
Yeah. And you're experiencing it. When you do this for 15 minutes a day, and then you implement mindfulness where you're just self-aware.
Yeah.
You're just in the moment. Like when I drive my car and I go to my office later, I'm not going to blast the music. I'm going to be. That's why we're called human beings. I'm going to be here. I'm going to see, take in the beautiful spring weather, right? And I'm going to use my thinking. I'm going to think about what I'm grateful for. I'm going to feel the emotions associated with that. And that's how we build as human beings, right, from the inside out. But our kids today don't get those experiences. I say in the previous book that boredom is the miracle grow for the mind and emotions.
So true. It's so true. That's where all creativity starts. That's where everything begins. So life is, we've talked about it some, and life is different for kids today. You say it's harder than ever. And you say, and I want to hear more on this. You say more has changed in the last 10 years than the previous 10,000 years. Is that hyperbole? Is that true? And if so, is it, give us a little bit of, that seems like that's a lot to keep up with.
So if you think about, right, so you go back 10, 20 years ago and previous, what did kids do? They spent time outside, constantly playing. Mom and dad had to drag them back inside, right? They talked to one another in school at the table instead of being distracted from their devices, right? We didn't have this never-ending world of information and fear and everything else bombarding their brains, right? So a kid from 10 years ago was more like a kid from 2,000 years before that, in a sense of freedom, mental freedom. And that's the first chapter of Raising Healthy Teenagers, about mental freedom. Kids don't really have any mental freedom because they're so addicted to these things, right?
Yeah.
these devices, their games and so forth. They're distracted from themselves. They don't know how to use their mind, and they don't know who they are.
Yeah.
So for parents, the most important thing, you know what the most important thing is for a child's mental health outcomes?
What's that?
Spending time with their parents. And I don't mean just like being in the same room and everybody on a device.
Hmm.
And one thing I advise parents to do as well when you're at lectures and so forth, when you're, driving your kid to school, just look in the rearview mirror when you get to school. Every kid in the passenger seat is like this.
Yeah.
So there's no dialogue even during a 5 or 10 minute ride to school.
Hmm.
And that is like fertile ground, 180 days a year of connecting with your child and your child connecting with you. It's just all those moments, and we really, parents need to practice what we preach. When we're at home with our kids, we got to turn down our own stuff. We got to be among one another. We got to feel one another's energy, and we got to love each other.
So I want to make that really practical, because I love the idea. Something we should all do. A question we get a ton from people is, and it sounds very basic, well, what do I talk about? I mean, literally, like we don't know exactly what to talk about, especially when our kids get into teenage years. Legitimately, my son and I are very close, and he's 15, but sometimes it's like, I don't want to just give him another lesson. That, hey, how was your day at school, or how was tennis practice? That gets a little bit boring. So when you talk about spending time with your kids, what should we practically be doing? What should we be talking about? How can we make this really approachable for parents?
Yeah, so it's very interesting that you say that, because just think about that for a minute.
Yeah, I know.
Right? The fact that we don't,
it's ridiculous.
Know
Yeah,
what to talk about anymore, right? That is something that should be so organic that we shouldn't even have to think about, and always has been up until recently. But if we have to consciously think about what we're going to talk about, it doesn't have to necessarily be like, how'd you do on the chemistry test this week?
Yeah.
Did you take your did you hit off the tee today? In baseball and so forth.
Hmm.
It's a good idea to ask ask kids to speak with them instead of at them.
Yes.
And always advising them, just ask them open-ended questions. Hey, what's new with you? How was your day? How's your friend Luca doing? Anything new there? And then hear what they have to say, and kind of let them lead a little bit. And if they get quiet, that's okay too. We can prompt. But I know that's an interesting factor. Is what are we talking about? But when we do it, when we make it mandatory on a daily basis, like we bring back family dinner and so forth, in about a week it becomes organic again.
Yeah, yeah. What are some ways that can go sideways? And I don't want to be too leading with the question, but I'm just imagining myself hearing my son tell me something to me, jump on him. Oh, you can't talk to your teacher like that, or you can't. What are those ways that, or even stealing a glance at a phone, that sort of thing. So what are some of those vulnerability killers that can kind of derail those efforts for you to talk and be close with your kids?
Yeah. So of course, when you have teenagers, there's clashing, right?
Yeah. All right.
So I'll give you an example. What I do with my daughter, who's 16, because I just know how she rolls. So if she gives me, I remember like a few weeks ago, I know she's got this like hidden drawer with some candy in it. So I was looking for a little Reese's peanut butter cup, right? So I go in her room, she's doing her homework, and I'm like, hey, her name's Ashlyn. I said, hey, Ashlyn, you got any Reese's peanut butter cups for Dad? And she snaps at me, right? She snaps at me, right? And says, you always have to take my, So I paused, and I said, all right. And I went back downstairs because I knew what the outcome was going to be. And here's what the outcome was. About 10 minutes later, she came downstairs and gave me a hug and said, Dad, I'm sorry for snapping at you. Wow. So little things like that. You got to know, it really depends on each kid. But we do get in the habit of, constantly, going at our kids, trying to make sure you do this. Don't talk to me like that.
Right.
It's never good. You can never have a dialogue when one or both individuals are emotionally charged. Can't have a dialogue. Nobody could hear anything. So you got to let it diffuse, and then when the dust has settled, then you visit it.
The co-founder of Goaro, Heath Wilson, this is one of his like cornerstone parenting things, is just don't react. They tell you something shocking, don't react. They try to, in some ways they're probably testing you to some degree. I feel like my daughter, sometimes it's kind of like, can I really be open with Dad? So I'm going to whether pop off at him, similar to what Ashlyn did, or maybe tell me a little bit of shocking news from school, and then to see if I react. And if I can stay non-reactive, oh, that's interesting, then that really does. It always goes the longer way. And then to your point there on Ashlyn, if you were to have gone back at her, I find the storyline then becomes Dad was mean to me. and that's it, right? And that's all, and you can't talk about anything else other than the fact that dad was mean to me, right?
That's the only thing you're going to remember and take away from that dialogue. That's the only
Yeah.
thing. And it's like married couples, same thing. I counsel married couples too. And that's, when people get into a disagreement and an argument and it
Mm,
becomes a right or wrong thing, the
yeah.
only thing that each party remembers is what the other person said to them or how they treated them. That's the only thing they take
That's
away from it.
God, that's
The
so
message
true.
can't penetrate. So you got to let it settle and then have a conversation like we're having right now. And then we can hear and take in the message.
It's so, again, it's, the couple things you've said, the 15 minutes of boredom, it's so simple, it's so approachable, yet I wonder how many people will actually go do it, even though it's so simple, not reacting emotionally. It's so simple, it's so basic. It would solve so many problems if we did that. And it's amazing what would happen. And then in doing it, it's almost like a double benefit, because in not emotionally responding back, the other person can then trust you a little bit more, but because they know, like, okay, dad can handle me being real. And then when you trust it, then that makes them less likely to then pop off the next time, because they know they trust you. You have a good foundation there.
And it trains you to be present, to live
Mm,
in the now, to live in the
yeah.
moment, right? Because we're never present. We're always, somewhere else distracted. And when we can train ourselves to be in the present, we become less impulsive. Like one
Yeah.
thing I see now, Joey, is I can't, and I talk about it in raising healthy teenagers. I cannot believe in the last couple of years the amount of kids exhibiting oppositional, defiant behavior towards their
Yeah.
parents, and that's because they're impulsively reacting. And I have kids in my office, and I train them that as soon as they feel an emotion come up, they have to pause. They have to remember to come into the present moment, take a breath of air, pause for a few seconds, and that's all it takes. So instead of just operating on pure raw emotion, you can now use intellect and think about
Hmm.
for a split second what my reaction is going to lead to.
Because it is important to feel, to in you know this a lot better than I do, but that's not a suppression of a feeling. That's actually the full feeling of a feeling. I mean, isn't that what you're supposed to do in mindfulness, is to feel all of your feelings, and then once you've fully felt them, only then are you able to process them mentally and decide what you do with the feeling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so in pausing, that mindfulness allows you to then not, back to the Nietzsche quote, it allows you to control the thought instead of the thought, or in this case, controlling the feeling instead of the feeling controlling you.
Yeah. And furthermore, like by doing that, if a kid actually really, really worked on that and getting into his present moment, eventually over time, that hasty feeling wouldn't even manifest. It
Wow.
would be like a split second. And then, okay, I'm calm. I don't need to, my emotions don't need to react to this trivial thing.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So it's really, you build on it. It has a very positive snowball effect.
Wow. All right, I want to get into raising healthy teenagers. I have it right here. I've been devouring it. It's so good, Tom. And I want to, back to the what's going on in our children's minds and lives and why. I want to tell you, I want to hit us with something, and it may be the same question, but I find that parents can be very naive, myself included. What would surprise parents of teenagers, and maybe what would shock parents of teenagers, and they realize, holy crap, they're experiencing that, or they're seeing that, or they're feeling that? What would be maybe a surprise and or a shock to parents if you told a naive parent?
Well, one thing, for me, something I have a chapter on this in the book is, you know, marijuana smoking.
Yeah.
Okay, so you take a teenager, right? And no matter what they tell you, the kids are smoking more marijuana than they were 30 years ago. I don't
Sure.
care what the statistics say, right? I just see this stuff every day.
Right.
And what people don't realize, and I've dealt with a lot of kids where the parents are okay with it. They don't have a problem with their kids smoking marijuana, believe it or not.
Wow.
But what a lot of people don't know is that there are more emergency room visits, okay, for people having something known as cannabis-induced psychosis, a cannabis-induced psychotic episode. There are more emergency room visits per day in the United States for marijuana than any other drug.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's because the THC levels back in 1990, when I graduated high school,
Mm.
the THC levels were like 3 to 5%. And now, since it's become legalized and regulated and all this stuff, it can be 80 to 90%, and it's
Oh my
causing psychotic
gosh.
episodes. Yeah, yeah. And our kids, and the problem is, our kids, our teenagers and even pre-teenagers, think it's harmless because that's what the
Yes.
message has been sent. It's harmless. Oh yeah, it's innocuous. It's harmless, and
Yeah.
it's a wrecking ball. for kids when they're younger, because it just, I see it every day, just destroys, strips everything away from them.
Wow. You get into the substance abuse, is alcohol typically, well, actually, maybe this isn't a foregone conclusion. I was going to say, is alcohol kind of the gateway into marijuana, or do some kids actually understand the detrimental effects of alcohol, and so they just go to marijuana instead?
Yeah, a little bit of both, a little
Yeah.
bit of both. It's not, they're kind of both, it's not, one doesn't necessarily lead to the other in my experience. Those
Yeah.
are just, both substances that are legal,
Got
and
it.
it's, and kids are like, they like to experiment and do stuff. And,
Yeah.
um, yeah, but I've had kids that like smoke marijuana and they're like, I don't need alcohol, but it
Yeah.
has a different psychological impact long
Sure.
term.
That is very surprising, very shocking. You said, you go on tomkersting.com, you can see the top 5 questions you hear. And there's a question you had on there that said, when should I get my kid a smartphone? And how about you give your answer to that? This one did shock me.
Yeah, this is like, this is a little bit of an uppercut, right?
Yeah.
So that question, every time I give a lecture, every time comes up. Parent will raise their hand and say, what is the right age to get my kid a smartphone? And my answer is this, Joey: when you feel comfortable with your child watching pornography.
Oh, it is. It's like that's more than an uppercut. That's like body blow after body blow. My gosh.
And that's, and right now we have, the average age of first smartphone issuance is 10 and a half years old.
Mm.
Right. And these are like, I call them the modern day weapons of mass destruction. It's behind all the issues we're seeing.
Mm. I think that is as I've learned more about the prevalence of pornography, that has shocked me most, probably as a parent, that it's not specifically a boy issue. It's boys and girls. It's both genders, and their exposure to it is very, very young, and they're seeing things their minds are not equipped for. Most people's are not equipped for. And it is a very, very real thing. Is that a smartphone specific issue? I got to think that in 1995 for you, you weren't hearing a lot of instances of pornography prevalence among teenage boys and girls. Is that a smartphone specific issue?
Well, kids always explored, those
Yeah.
things. You go back like the 80s and 90s, kids would put their like Playboy magazines out in the woods and they'd
Yeah.
blow mold on them and they'd look at pictures. But
Yeah.
now it's like, a kid gets a phone, they go on YouTube, there's going to be an ad of an attractive woman or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And a kid is going to click on that. And that's going to take them down a path, when they're trying to figure things out, and
Right.
they can really get sucked down that rabbit hole. So it's definitely more of a social media modern day problem, more so now than it was a problem in the past.
That is shocking. It really is. All right, so I'm going to go. There are a couple chapters here that were really specifically poignant for me. I want to start with the mental freedom chapter. Will you talk a little bit about the mental freedom, what that means, and then kind of what are some of these antidotes to what we can do to letting our kids experience mental freedom?
Yeah. So, again, like the mental freedom, you look at COVID and like everybody was mentally locked down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of mental freedom is that 15 minutes of silent time we talked about, but it's also engaging with other people, right? Human beings are social and emotional creatures. And that's how we develop, emotional intelligence, social skills, communication skills. It's how we develop an understanding of self, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thought. So I'm actually on the chapter right now.
Yeah.
So one of the most important things that we can do with kids, right? So for example, play. This is for younger kids, right? Play is down 70% in recent years, right? And every time a kid goes outside and plays, it activates something like 3,000 genes in the cortex part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that shapes them socially. So a kid cannot actually learn, so becoming a social being and a person that can regulate their emotions and handle adversities and handle a ball being taken away from them at the playground and so forth requires practice. And the practice is, being outside, replacing screen time with green time. Okay. And most kids nowadays prefer to be indoors playing video games or going on their phone than they prefer being outdoors with their peers. And that's I call that their natural habitat. So we've removed them from their natural habitat. And that's really an important thing to get them out there.
It's huge. And you talk about, I love this term. You talk about nature deficit disorder. Hit us a little bit with what that concept means, the nature deficit disorder.
Yeah, so I stole that, and I cited it in the book from the
You did
person.
cite it. You did. That's true.
So I didn't really steal it. And so basically, it's everything shows that the more time that kids spend outdoors in nature, whether it's playing, whatever it is, something just being outside and the sun being out there, whether you go for a hike or you go in the woods and so forth. All of the research shows that kids that spend a lot more time outside than they do inside, their mental health outcomes are substantially better than the kids who are cooped up inside.
Hmm. I believe. Listen, yesterday after reading again, I was reading Raising Healthy Teenagers, and so my daughter was feeling she was feeling a little bit down. She was feeling a little bit, just kind of maybe a little bit lethargic. I said, hey, Gianna, I said, go outside. We're going to work on the back deck. I need to do some stuff. She said, can I, so I want you to be outside. She said, well, can I jump on the trampoline during that time? She did it for 25 minutes. Tom, I'm telling you, it was a different kid. It did
Oh,
just
yeah.
that 25 minutes. And it shouldn't be a shock, but those things happen. Those are, and it's not, yes, sustained over time is great, but truly instant results. It was an amazing thing.
No question about it. So, another thing people don't realize when it comes to mental health, we've become this pill popping nation. Everybody's on some kind of medication, right? And what people don't know, and what Big Pharma doesn't want them to know, is that physical exercise is scientifically proven to be more effective for treating symptoms of anxiety and depression than medication. So when I'm giving lectures, I tell kids, I said, I'll tell the audience, I'll tell the parents too, I'll say, if you do these two things, okay, one is sit in silence and get to know yourself and do that on a daily basis. And number two is incorporate physical exercise, activity, going for a run, a walk on a daily basis, right? If you incorporate those two things into your life, I hypothesize that the mental health epidemic would go down by 90%.
Wow.
That's what I predict. I mean, I don't have any evidence to support that, but that's what I believe would happen.
Sheesh. I believe it. I'm taking copious notes here because it's sit in silence, spend time outside exercising. We talk about talk about substance abuse, and when I think as a parent, especially when your kids in their teenage years, you're still thinking about them as an adolescent, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10 years old, and so it's easy to think not my kid, and I think it probably becomes a shock. So who would you say is at risk here? And then in the substance abuse, maybe I'm sure that's everybody, but what are some things that would maybe indicate a higher incidence of someone being at risk?
Well, kids that actually have attention deficit disorder, because a lot of them, especially ones that have the impulsivity component,
Sure.
are more prone to, engage in marijuana use and so forth, right?
Okay.
But I think just it's a social contagion in many ways. So, kids tend to do what everybody else does, right?
Yeah.
That's how we operate. Even adults, we go with the flow. It's a form of social conformity.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I talk about it in the book. So it starts off where, a kid goes to high school and they start meeting other kids, and all of a sudden a kid whips out a joint or whatever, and they were told not to do that. And then they try it and it wasn't as bad as mom and dad said. And then, it evolves into this very terrible snowball effect.
Yeah.
But what I tell kids that I counsel and what I help parents to understand is, if starting at a young age, like I've always told my kids, you're a leader. You are not going to be a follower. You're a leader. And I drilled that into their minds, right? So basically, the definition of a leader, my favorite definition, because there are many, is that a leader always does what is right, even when it's not popular.
Yeah.
Right. And a follower is just going to go along and follow the crowd, right? And do what everybody else does. And that's, the leaders are the ones that live by principle, by virtue, by values. And we got to drill that into our kids.
Yeah. What about the parent who might be listening, who their kid has, they did find a vape pen, and they have, the kid has smoked a little bit of marijuana, or they found them, they realized they drank or they got drunk or whatever it is. So how do you, as a parent, then, how do you respond to that? Is it a punishment? Is it you pull them out of social circles? Like how should a parent handle a situation like that?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, when, if the parent right now that's listening who, found some vape pens in their 14 or 15-year-old son's drawer, it's not their friend's stuff. Because that's what they told you. It's my friends. I'm holding it for a friend. That's
holding a vape pen for a friend.
It is theirs. So what you want to do is you don't have to freak out and go crazy on your kid, but you want to let them know in a very stern way that in this household, we
Mm-hmm.
have a zero tolerance for that. So what I told my kids, both of them, my son is going to be 20 years old next week. He's in college, and he's never had a sip of alcohol in his life.
Wow.
I don't know where he got that from. I mean, I like to drink beers every now and
Yeah.
then, but he just hasn't. When his friends all drink and do that stuff, and they're all good kids, but he does not do it. And I'm not being naive. His friends tell me, I know this. He's just not interested in it. He's a very social kid. And my daughter, to my knowledge, hasn't done anything yet, right?
Right.
And so what I tell them, I have told them there's a zero tolerance for this in the household. If I catch you with marijuana, you're not allowed to live here.
Wow.
You're not allowed to live here. You're gonna have to live somewhere else.
And you'd follow through on that.
Yeah, well, I haven't had to get to that point yet.
Okay, got it.
You know what I mean? I want them to know I'm not going to tolerate that.
Yeah.
Because in my profession, if people could shadow me for a day, as a therapist and see the stuff I deal with, you know what I mean? That's why I have a very, very firm, belief on that. And it just leads to other things. Now we have fentanyl making its way into marijuana even now, and it's just, and I really want, I use that as a motivational strategy. Like, you're a leader. We're not going to allow this.
Yeah. How about alcohol? How do you advise families to handle alcohol? So you said you do have, the occasional beer. So growing up, when your kids were growing up, how did you handle alcohol in the house? How did you talk to them about that? How did that transition from when they were 5, 6, 7 years old to they were, 15, 16, 17 years old?
I always just told them at a young age, I said, the Kerstings we're rule followers, right? The drinking age is 21. You're not allowed to drink until you're 21.
Yep.
So, and so many parents, they feel like, all right, well, my kid's a senior in high school. They're going off to college anyway. Right. So I see that side of it, but I want to get into their minds that we follow rules. You're not allowed to drink until you're 21 years old legally.
Yeah.
Maybe I think the law is you can drink with parental supervision under that age, but I'm sticking to that. And because the bottom line is the longer you can delay anything, like the earlier that an individual starts drinking, the higher the risk of developing alcoholism is.
See, that's huge. That line really stood out to me as well. And maybe it should be self-evident, but I don't know that I thought about it in those terms. Yeah, the younger someone starts, more likely they are to form an addiction. And you just don't know if your child is predisposed to addiction. That is a thing. I mean, that's a chemical thing. And if you're predisposed to it and you get it early, that's just probably the worst possible thing you could do for your child, I would assume, right?
Yeah. I mean, there is one way of knowing, like, if you look at your relatives, and if you got like a parent listening right now, if your brother's an alcoholic, your parents were alcoholics, your sister's an alcoholic, and all the uncles and everybody are alcoholics, your child is very likely going to become an alcoholic if they start drinking, particularly at an earlier age. Yeah. There's actually some, I remember when I was back in graduate school a long time ago, I was taking a class called the Biopsychosocial Perspectives of Drugs. And there were some professionals, some experts that stated that you can diagnose somebody with alcoholism that has never had a sip of alcohol.
Wow.
If they have such a strong family history of it, they can legitimately be diagnosed as an alcoholic, even though they never drank.
Wow. I believe it. I really do. And so then why would we, especially in the name of, I think about this as a parent sometimes, especially in the name of fitting in, to fold to that, to acquiesce. Oh, all my friends are drinking. Yeah, I guess it's okay. That's the worst thing you could do. The greatest gift you could give them is laying down the principles. In this home, we don't do this. Here are the principles we live by. We are rule followers, and here's why. What a great gift. And they may be mad about it, but you could also easily say, like, why on earth did they let me do that? And now I'm a full-blown alcoholic. I mean, you play it out to the nth degree. So yeah, I love that.
They're going to push back. And I'll say one other thing. I remember 20-something years ago, I was in the audience of a guy giving a lecture about teenagers.
Yeah.
And, teenagers can get, they can get a little nasty with the parents, right? And push back, right? We know that. And he said, if your teenager doesn't hate you, you're doing something wrong.
It's true, because they want to do a bunch of stuff they shouldn't do for themselves right there. If you're really truly thinking about their future. One thing I like that you said at the end of the substance abuse chapter was, and it's basic, but you just said you got to pay very close attention to your kids. And this goes back to your spending some time with them. And if you notice and taking notice of those subtle differences in the things that you're seeing, and that only comes if you're fully engaged, if your phone is away, you're fully locked in with them. because then you can see if something different is happening, right? And so that's not only is it just good to spend time with your kids, build their self-worth, but then you're able to diagnose if something might be happening that's off, out of the ordinary.
Yeah, another thing too, to that point is, a lot of parents nowadays, I'll hear them say, well, should I check my kids' drawers and stuff
Yeah.
like that? I don't want to invade their privacy. I want them to trust me, right? And I remember my dad, very spiritual guy, would always say to us, like whenever we push back, and he said no, he would say, God didn't give you to me for me to trust you. He
Oh,
gave you to me for you to trust me.
God, that's good.
Yeah. So I think we need to, that's something we have to, we really, I think that's just spot on.
And I think sometimes as parents, we probably, because we see our own shortcomings and failures and inadequacies, it's probably easy to then think to yourself to some degree, well, who am I to be a moral authority here? But no. We have to, I'm speaking to myself here. We have to understand that this is our job. This is the most important thing we could do. We have to take it seriously, even if we know we're hypocritical. Okay, does that mean your kids should suffer from that as well? No, we have to, and again, ideally we would continue to rise to the occasion and be the right type of person. But this is, despite who we are, we have to step in and be right for our kids. I want to talk real quick about body image. You referenced it, and there's a chapter in the book, Obesity and Body Image. And so I'm curious, there's this balancing act, I feel like, and maybe there's not, but when we talk, how do we talk to our kids about healthy habits and nutrition and food without them developing an unhealthy relationship with food? Do you know what I mean? If the goal is like, well, you don't want to become overweight, well, is that all of a sudden creating, I never know exactly how to talk about a good relationship with food and nutrition without it ultimately leading to some kind of body shaming. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I think it really should start at a young age. Like essentially, whatever foods our kids are eating is because of us, right? Because
Yeah,
we're the ones
that's right.
bringing it in from the supermarket, right?
Right.
That's fine. Kids, of course, are going to want some candy and junk food and so forth, and that's fine. But if it becomes like the staple of their diet, that's when it becomes a problem. Right now, we have the number one problem in the country right now is a childhood obesity epidemic. Right. And it's because kids are sedentary. They don't move as much. They're not outside running around. Their metabolisms aren't kicked in. They're sitting behind a screen. That's part one. And all of the bad food, right? So the fast food marketing used to take place in TV and radio ads. Now it makes its way where the kids are on social media. So all the big fast food industries, that's where all this stuff is, through sponsorships and marketing and so forth, is being directed to them. And we have this abundance of unhealthy food in our society, and our kids. So it's really up to us to introduce healthier foods and let the junk food be like a treat, like a snack here and there, right?
Yeah.
Body image, but the body image part. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, there was a story that came out where thousands of girls, teenage girls throughout the United States, developed fine motor tics, right? So they were going to their pediatricians because they had these motor tics, right? Little shakes and stuff.
Got it.
Even though they didn't have Tourette syndrome. So when doctors collected the data in the United States and in a couple of countries in Europe, they were blown away because they had no idea what was going on here. Why was this happening? And the common denominator is that every one of those girls was watching hours and hours of TikTok videos of people with Tourette syndrome.
Whoa.
So just from doing that, that's how the brain works. Whatever our mind is immersed in, it becomes. So they actually started physiologically, unintentionally mimicking those people on TikTok simply from being exposed to it. And how does that relate to body image? What are we exposed to all the time? What are kids seeing all the time? Perfect figures of people over and over again, comments back and forth, gets in their head, right? Yeah. Just like that, those TikTok videos, and now they're identifying themselves as not being in good shape or whatever it might be. So it's all this, again, it goes back to all this outside in stuff, right? And we got to get our kids working from the inside out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've found myself even talking about, I got to be careful of just the way I talk about myself and, making sure that I'm not becoming too obsessive about talking about exercising or eating well for myself, not even projecting it upon them, just saying it for myself. And they're starting to hear that, oh, well, you must, it's sometimes it feels a little bit overwhelming. We just have to watch our every step, which is probably good, right?
Yeah, I'm a workout freak. That's
Yeah.
why I worked out every day. I hit the gym, and
Yep.
and I do it for to keep myself in shape and alive, so I don't
Yep.
drop dead, right? But
Hmm.
even more importantly is if I decide to take a day off at the gym, it's a completely different day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am just mentally endorphined out,
Sure.
feeling great just from going to the gym. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely.
if I skip a day, I feel like a flat tire.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's really just teaching our kids that, like, working out and stuff doesn't. If you're obsessing over it and looking in the mirror because you're looking to get feedback from
Mm.
others, you're going about it the wrong way. That's not what self-esteem is.
Interesting. That's a good distinction. Are you looking for external validation? Is that your goal?
Yeah, and
Um,
if that is the goal, that's not definitive of self-esteem.
right.
It would be called others' esteem.
Yeah. Mm. Curious. These are my own separate questions. I've heard before, and maybe in all of this, in these raising healthy teenagers, is it a safe assumption that you do these things so that you can release them into the wild well? Is that why we do those things? And, when it's time for them to go off on their own, is this just all about how do you prepare them to live independently?
You mean in terms of doing what things, like teaching them the right lessons and
Maybe
values?
all this. I mean, even the premise of the book. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
yeah. It's how do you really is that the goal, is releasing them well?
So I mean, this book, we have chapters. It
Yeah.
starts off with mental freedom, social
Yeah.
nutrition, fear-filled nation, behavior, all the stuff with behavior and conduct issues, and then obesity, body image, substance abuse, and then school and learning and college admissions and so forth.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes. Reading through this text of this book, right, and utilizing the strategies is so that we can have our kids, when they leave our house, be completely confident, motivated, independent, and insulated from all of the nonsense that's out there.
Mm.
So instead of walking into this fear world, walking in, not ego. I'm not talking about ego and cockiness. That's a lack of confidence.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a self-knowing, right? A self-understanding, right? Founded on thought, positive emotion, depth, and bringing that into the fold. And the only thing that can come from that is success, whatever one's definition of success is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. What about for someone like me? So my son's 15. I think we've done a pretty good job, but then I have this, internal asking myself, have I done enough? Have we, is he really going to be able to be fine when he's confronted with the drugs and alcohol? Is he, spiritually, does he have the right daily disciplines to set him up for success there? What kind of general advice would you have for someone like me who's, hey, I'm looking down the barrel of him going away in a few years, and I just want to make sure that I've done enough.
Yeah, so I think it's really good. So I just shook the camera there. Sorry. So what we often do as parents, we are largely reactive.
Yeah.
That's how we often communicate. Where we react to our kids. Hey, why don't
Right.
you put away the dishes? Why don't you study for that test? So we're constantly reacting. A better strategy is being proactive.
Yeah.
So just out of the blue, having a conversation, like going up to your son, saying, "You know what? It's something I want to tell you. What is it? Do you know how proud I am of you?
Hmm.
For what, Dad? For being you. That's
Yeah.
what I'm proud of. For being a person that's a leader, that's kind, that's compassionate, right? And that is just, so that's proactive, but it's also positive reinforcement. That's
Yeah.
your kid's gonna walk away feeling like, wow, I want to keep doing more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. When something feels good, you're going to want to do more of it. That's such a basic concept, but it really is true. I want to close with one question. I don't want I didn't prep you for this, but I want you to hit us between the eyes. I want you to give us some truth that we need to hear, even if it feels inconvenient, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if we're defensive or offended by it. I just think you have so much. Plus, you're a New Jersey guy. I mean, that's all you guys know how to do is just hit people between the eyes, right? But I do hit us between the eyes with the truth bomb here that all of us need to hear today.
All right, so this is, we got a parents audience here. So
Yeah.
the truth bomb is this, okay? The world out there is not a terrible place.
Wow.
Okay. It's not a terrible place. It appears to be a terrible place because that's all we see is the terrible things. So if we keep our kids as much as possible away from all that stuff and keep them in our little world here under our roof, not lock and key, but just
Sure.
keep them to our values and so forth. Your children are going to thrive, bottom line. And that's
Wow.
up to us. That's up to us. So the truth bomb is what we need to do right now, parents, is we got to change. And
Wow.
what we have to change is what we're doing when we're around our kids. And
Mm,
that is making sure we're having quality time with them and deep dialogue and not, lost in our own computer and phone and TV and so forth.
dude.
Our kids need us. They need our time is what they need.
I didn't expect such a hopeful response to that. Well, how hopeful is that? Is they're going to you didn't say then they're more likely to thrive. You said they're going to thrive if we do those things. I love that, Tom. Thank you for that. That was really, really good. So people need to go to tomkersting.com, KERSTING. And I'm just telling you, I've read it. Raising Healthy Teenagers. You got to go read it. And I'm going to go read Disconnect as well. Disconnected or
Yeah,
Disconnect?
this
Sorry.
is it right here.
Yeah. Boom.
Disconnected.
I'm going to go pick that up as well. Tom, what else? Where are you on social media that people can follow you? Where else can people go look into your work and interact
Yeah,
with
you
you?
just Google me. I mean, I go on TV a lot and stuff
Yeah.
like that, but I'm not a big, I'm not a big like poster on Instagram and all
Yeah.
that. It's
That
not,
doesn't shock me.
I tell I have people publicists and so forth. You got to do more social media. I'm like, you know what? Screw social media.
Yeah.
Find me.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's helps me get my word out, but I'll go out. I'd rather go out and lecture, and reach
Yes.
people that way. If I got something coming up, I post it on. I have like I don't know, Instagram. I don't really use it.
Well, especially
Facebook.
you can go deep. I mean, to put a post out there, maybe it changes something, but to have an hour-long discussion like here where you have a captive audience and people really listening, hanging on your every word, that's really where the difference is made.
This is how I do it. Like I do a lot of
Yeah.
podcasts that you
Yeah.
guys will put it out there. People
Yeah.
can see it and I can reach people. And that's it.
Tom, this is wonderful. Thank you. I feel like I owe you some money for this, but it's for the hour-long session. But
I'll send you a bill, all right, man?
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, Tom Kersting, thank you so much for joining the RO podcast. We're grateful for this conversation and for your work. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Joey. It was great.
Thank you, brother.